Okay, I'm going to do another video. This is going to be about the Matthew principle to the extent that I can understand it, because I was trying to crunch some numbers. I'm not a mathematician, and there was one figure that I could not come up with because it would involve I wouldn't be doing this video. And I wanted to do it tonight. I'm sure somebody, it's not even that difficult. If somebody were a mathematician, they could probably pretty easily figure out what I'm trying to figure out. But and talk about that in how it relates to the economy and the current wealth, the intensity of the wealth disparity that we are experiencing right now. And one of the numbers I did was basically, in the hypothetical scenario that I played out, the disparity between the richest person and the wealth of the median person. So not the average, because that distorts things. It depends, but in this case, the average kind of distorts things. If you look up the average wealth of the average American, average, on Google or other things, if you grok it or whatever, it says something insane like $500,000. And the reason it says that is because the average is so dramatically pulled up by the intensely rich people. I just looked this up, and for the purposes of what I'm going to be talking about, I'm just going to go ahead and say that Elon Musk has $500 billion, that he's worth $500 billion. It's not really able to be calculated in that kind of case. And I'm not saying, oh, he's not rich. That's not the point of what I'm saying. It's just really difficult to calculate someone's actual net worth, especially when you're getting into stocks and stuff like that change, and all of his assets that go up and down every day, and he probably checks them, because this is like a game to him on some level, and it's a fun game for him because he's winning. He's the richest man in the world, I think. And there are a lot. I'm not a big fan of Elon Musk, but I can think of a lot worse people that I would choose to be the richest person in the world. And this is the evaluation. Who knows how real that even is? He's said himself that he's not the richest person. That doesn't make sense to me. But anyway, and the reason I say 500 billion is that's sort of like a midway point, because he's on track to, if you look it up, apparently because of his evaluations and SpaceX and whatever else, he is now evaluated by some calculations, some people, to have 800 billion, to be worth 800 billion. But anyway, what I was talking about is the median wealth holder in America is calculated to be, like I said, the average is something like around 500K. Does that make any sense to anyone listening? No. Nobody listening. I know rich people. I know people who are worth a lot more than that. But I'm just saying, when you think about the average, most people are living paycheck to paycheck, as far as I know. Just generally, not like everyone, but a whole, a plurality of people are living paycheck to paycheck. But I'll save that particular thing that kind of shocked me in this particular hypothetical scenario that I was thinking about, as compared with what the reality is of the disparity between Elon Musk, the richest person in the world, and the median wealth holder. So the median would be something like, again, I had to look this up in a couple different places, partly because it didn't make sense to me, and also partly because, I wanted to cross-check. I wanted to cross-reference, So I used Google, I used Grok, I used ChatGPT. Pretty reliably, the median wealth of any person, however you want to say it, in the United States is calculated to be something like $110,000. Again, what are we really talking about? That doesn't even seem believable to me, but that's the stated number the median wealth for any given individual, in this country is calculated to be roughly around $100,000. That's what you find if you look it up in Google or pretty much any of these places. It says that on various websites. Again, the median. So like you're talking about not averaging, including the insanely wealthy people. You're talking about what is considered to be in the middle, So anyway, the Matthew effect is from the Bible. It's a quote from the Bible. I'm just going to paraphrase it. And it's basically, to those who have the most, more will be given. And from those who have nothing, even the little bit that they have will be taken from them. Now, you might hear that and think, well, that doesn't sound very nice. I don't know the context of it. I just know that it comes from probably, Matthew in the Bible, and it's taken from that. And again, that's paraphrasing. That's not the King James version. I'm just paraphrasing what the basic quote is. And there's an economic principle, and really it's a physical principle because it involves a power law, a power distribution that you see in nature. I mean, I can't think of examples right now because I'm not thinking about the natural examples. I'm thinking about it in the context of the economy. So here's basically the way you would play it out if you're trying to give an example of it. Now, so I watched a video earlier today from this lady explaining the Matthew principle. She did a very good job, but she left a couple things out, and the math in itself didn't make sense in a specific way that I'm going to explain. But the hypothetical scenario, and I'm going to try to make this simple because it's going to sound like it's complicated, but it's really not. But you have 10 people, right? And they all start out with $100. And then the game is basically, this is only really a fun game if you're winning. But the game is basically, you bet half of your money. So each person of those 10 people bets half of his or her money, which is, would be $50. And then, according to the law of like averages or whatever, if you're approaching it as a literal like coin toss, like 50-50 type of thing, you're going to have half of those people win and half of those people lose on the first round, hypothetically. And then, 5 people would end up having $50 and 5 people would end up having $150. Right there, it doesn't make sense. Okay, never mind. In the second, after the first round, it does make sense still, because if 5 of those people lose and 5 of those people win, you get 250. 5 people will have $250 together, the ones who lost, because they all have $50. Then the 5 people who won, they're going to have $150, and that adds up to 750. 150 times 5. But if you keep going to 10 examples and you have a person who wins 10 times, and each time they're betting half of their money, because that's the whole, you're betting half of your money every time. So at the end of 10 examples, the person who wins the coin toss or whatever, or the person from the very beginning, for whatever reason, well, no reason because it's random, but if the person who wins 10 times at the end of 10 rounds, that person has $5,767, I think. Yeah, there's going to be a little bit of a pause there because the low power thing came up on my phone, and every time that happens, I can't pause the video, and then I'm disoriented for a second. But yeah, so the point is, you have a game where it's 10 people. Each of those people start out with $100. And they're betting half of their money on each turn. So the person who is the luckiest person, and at the end of 10 rounds, he's won every round, that person is going to end up with $5,767. Now, right away, you have a problem, because if it's a closed system, this is the part that she didn't explain. So, or maybe she did explain it and somehow it went over my head or something. But the point is, like, from that perspective, it doesn't make sense, right? Because you're starting out with $1,000 because 10 people have $100, in a pool or whatever. And who are they taking? If you're betting within a pool. You know what I mean? So, like, somehow, if you're it's like a power law distribution. So at that point, you're dealing with just numbers. But if you're betting half of your money every time, that is what's going to happen if you do the math. The person who started out with $100 and wins 10 rounds of that game is going to end up with $5,767. And the person who and by the way, it doesn't matter which turn the person lost. If the next luckiest person, and if you just assume that there are 10 people and they each play the 10 rounds and they each start out with $100, there's going to be like a power law distribution thing. But in this case, you have to have you're assuming that every person won at least once. I don't want to explain why, but there's no person, and in her example, she kind of glossed over that, but it doesn't make sense for anybody to... I'm trying to find out a way to explain this that's not going to be confusing. Basically, the whole thing is, if you have a person who literally wins 0 times, that confuses the math of it, because in that case, you're going to have... There's going to be 11 numbers total. And so that's why it confuses the whole thing, because one person wins 10 times, one person wins 0 times. From 0 to 10, that's 11. That's 11 numbers. It's not just 10. 1 to 10 is 10. So I'm trying to simplify it, even though I feel like I'm not doing a good job. But so in this scenario that I'm talking about, the unluckiest person only wins once. And the luckiest person wins 10 times at the end of 10 rounds. And the luckiest person who... And they're all doing the same thing, where they're betting half of their money each turn. Like I said, the luckiest person who wins 10 times ends up with $5,767. The person who wins 9 times and loses once, and like I said, again... Interestingly enough, it's just the way the math is. It doesn't matter which turn he loses. It doesn't matter if he loses at the last on the 10th time or on the first, it doesn't matter which turn he loses on. The person who's lucky 90% of the time, or no, I don't want to say 90%, because again, that relates to what I was just talking about. But the person who wins 9 times and loses once ends up with $1,922, which is less than half of the person who wins, every time. So, and it goes down from there. So, like in this hypothetical example, even though when you're talking about randomness, it's not really going to happen that way generally, but in this example, you have one person who wins once and loses 9 times. You have the second luckiest person or no, the second to last luckiest person wins twice and loses 8 times, and so on. So you have, and that's a distribution, throughout the game. So then I came up with my own math, because I was thinking, I don't understand where they're getting the money from if the last person has $5,767, because they all started out with $1,000. Again, like I said, I don't remember her explaining that in the video, and I looked for someone who would point it out in the comments, and no one did. And it's partly because her video was sort of about the economy and how some people are unlucky and some people are lucky. So anyway, this is the part where I had to do my own math. I'm not really very good at math. I can, if Brian May from Queen were to try to be doing this, he would have been able to figure it out much more quickly. Apparently he, he's an astrophysicist, and the reason I'm even saying that is because I have a book where he was talking about how he built his guitar with his dad's help, but he came up with a formula to space out the frets on his guitar, and it involved something like half times something to the power of 12. Obviously I'm butchering it, but the point is, he came up with that, and then he had the distances to, I don't know, 8 decimal points of the inches that he would have to use to space out the frets on his guitar. He figured that out. So anyway, I figured out, if you have $1,000 and I don't know what that's the part I couldn't figure out, is the amount that each person starts out with. If you have the that part was obvious, because each person is starting out with $100, but I couldn't figure out how much they're betting to come up with the power law distribution where everything would then add up to $1,000 so that it would make sense in that distribution. That's the part that I couldn't figure out, but it doesn't really matter for the point that I wanted to make. And like I said, if I wanted to figure that out, I'd be here all night and I wouldn't make the video. Okay, so in the math that I figured out, where everyone starts out with $100 and it doesn't go over $1,000 in other words, because that doesn't make sense if you're within a closed system. Where's the extra money going to be coming from? So unless you're talking about inflation or something, and that's not the point of the point of the whole exercise, is basically to show that the luckiest person way outdoes the other people, even the second luckiest person. So these are the numbers that come up with that I calculated. If you have 10 rounds and the luckiest person wins 10 times and you still have $1,000, the person who wins 10 times would end up with $667 roughly. And these numbers are rounded off. Then the second luckiest person, who won 9 times and lost once, would have $222. And then the next person, who lost twice, would have $74. And down like that. And the person who only won once, I think, if I'm doing my math correctly, but the point is this all adds up to 1,000. And I think it is a power law, So the person who is the least lucky in this scenario has 3 cents, and they all started out with $100. And again, this is like coin toss, like 50-50. It's meant to be random, So that's sort of the way things happen in life, even though we try to prevent that from various laws and regulations and, standards and stuff like that. And just the fact that people can see that some people are lucky and that, it's nice to be lucky, but at the same time, there are the dregs of society, and unless you just want to kill them or whatever, and you're at that point, you don't even live in a civilization, you're going to do something to try to raise their standard of living and correct for the randomness, that basically will appear in nature. So what I did was I took the in between in 10 people and in 10 different results at the end, you're not going to have a midway point, right? And you're not going to take the average, because it's going to raise that average up to make it look like the average person has, something relatively close to $667, even though that wouldn't be the case at all. You're going to want to take the median, because that's better representative of what, the average person really has. So the 2 middle numbers are, again, these are rounded, but the 2 middle numbers are 8 and 3. So the middle point between 8 and 3 is 5.5, I think. Yeah. So you take, and that's $5.50. So in this scenario, at the end of the game, the median wealth holder is worth $5.50. So in this scenario, in this hypothetical where you're taking 10 rounds, where the last person is insanely rich compared to, the bottom like 6 people or whatever, the richest person with $667 because of random pure luck. This doesn't really happen in real life, obviously, but this is like a hypothetical scenario to explain how wealth becomes distributed. And the game Monopoly if I understand correctly, was literally invented to demonstrate this principle. And if you play Monopoly with people, a lot of times it gets to be where it's not very fun, because the person who has accrued some money and rolled the dice and happened to be lucky, they'll just get more and more money, and they'll be able to they'll just get more and more money and buy properties and stuff. And when you land on their property, you have to pay them, even though you already don't have a lot of money, because they've already gotten all the money. I think that's so. It's been so long since I played Monopoly, but if you land on somebody on a space, on another player's space, and they have a bunch of properties, don't you have to pay them? But anyway, so that's what the game Monopoly is basically just demonstrating. I mean, I think it's a fun enough game, but generally there's nothing wrong with it, but when you're playing, it kind of gets to where people are fatigued, and it's let's stop playing this, you have $10,000 now or whatever it is. So in this hypothetical, so this is what I'm getting to. In this hypothetical, and this is what kind of shocked me. In this hypothetical scenario, which is just completely based on luck, so there's no fairness principle involved. There's nobody, because it's a hypothetical, there's no idea of fairness within this example. The median wealth holder has $5.50. The richest person in this game with $667 has 121 times the wealth of the median person. In real life, and again, like I said at the beginning, I took these numbers, and you can't really have exact numbers, because even if you're talking about that's because people don't want people to see the real reality, and because of propaganda, and because the media is owned by rich people and stuff like that, and they don't want the proletariat to be, getting upset or whatever, They want them to just keep focusing on bread and circuses and stuff. Even aside from that, it gets very complicated to figure out these numbers. But basically, you just take the idea that Elon Musk has he's worth 500 billion, right? And like I said it before again, the median wealth of the average person, I'm not sure if that's the way to say it, but you know what I mean. The median wealth holder in the United States, from the calculations that I saw, is estimated to have roughly $100,000. That doesn't make sense to me, but that's from what I could gather from the research that I did. So, in real life, in the United States, Elon Musk has 5 million times the wealth of the median wealth holder in the United States. So that demonstrates that we have a problem. And again, like I said, people can say, well, that's just numbers. Who cares if he has 500 billion? And it's well, no, it's not just numbers on a screen. This is real wealth that he has. And again, I'm not saying that Elon Musk is a bad person. That has nothing to do with what I'm talking about. A lot of rich people are bad people. A lot of them are just very hard-working people that are really into getting rich, which isn't in itself some sort of bad thing. It's really what you do with your money. And then it's like I said with Jeff Bezos, in the last video that I'm probably going to private, but you have someone like him talking about how it's not going to help if he gets. I'm distracted here because my computer turned off. If you have someone like him and he's talking about, don't bother taxing me anymore, that's not going to help. I don't even really necessarily think he's completely wrong. But it seems like he's not thinking about the fact that the economy is fucked, in the sense that you have people that are basically just normal working people that are trying to survive, and they barely can. That's not civilized. You're not living in a civilization at that point. So the way that I conceptualize this, and the way that I would present it to a person I was arguing with, which I never do, my boss is kind of into this. He says, what's so bad about being filthy rich? They didn't do anything wrong. And that's not really my point. You have a lot of people on like Reddit and stuff like that who really have a deep resentment against rich people. That's not really the way I'm thinking about it. The way I'm thinking about it is sort of like the math of it. So let's say you have someone like Bill Gates. I don't even know what he's worth now, but let's just say has $200 billion, and somebody else who's working hard makes $50,000 a year. Is he working? So let me just do the math right now. So let's just take the example of how much wealth you have, because that makes it more complicated. Because it's not so much about how much Bill Gates makes in a year. It's really about his wealth and his assets and stuff like that. So he's worth, let's just say, 200 billion, something like that, right? And you have, according to Grok and ChatGPT, I can't use Claude right now. I'm not going to get into why, but like Claude is really my preference to do anything that involves math. And by the way, that was borne out because I was trying to get Grok to explain certain things to me, and it kept coming up with the craziest fucking numbers, like it didn't make any sense. And that's how you know that LLMs aren't intelligent. They're not crunching numbers. They're making associations. I'm not saying they're worthless, but it's not doing math. So anyway, at least not the math that made any sense to me. So let's just go with the wealth. So let's say, according to these, AIs, and according to what I saw on Google, somehow the median wealth holder in the United States has $100,000, is worth $100,000, whatever that may mean, whether it's their car, their house, whatever it is. So that would mean Bill Gates with $200 billion. He has 200,000 times the wealth of the median wealth holder in the United States, who theoretically has $100,000. So is he working 200,000 times as hard as that person? And how would you even measure that? So if you want to take work as something that you value, and let's say you want to take, and I know that this isn't the capitalist perspective, but it has meaning. So let's say you want to take the degree to which someone works hard as a unit of like value. Like that person's valuable because he's a plumber, or he's an electrician, or whatever. He's some kind of working class something, and he's providing value because he works hard. Is Bill Gates, does he work 200,000 times as hard as that person? It's a rhetorical question, of course not. And yet we all accept this. So something has to give. I don't know what's going to happen. Like I said in the last video, I feel like before things like this, and this is the worst in history, and there's other metrics that you can look at. What if Alt-Hist does good videos about this, even though he's a little bit nuts, but he does basically know what he's talking about. And I'd like to do a video about End Times, the book that I read by Peter Turchin at some point. I want to reread it because I think the first time I read it, I was reading it on the Kindle and I couldn't make any notes. So I would like to read it again and then kind of like do a review on it. But there's all kinds of metrics that you can look at when a society is degenerating. And one of them is first of all, average height. If you control for race, because I know what some people might be thinking, the average height has gone down. There's an obvious reason. You might assume that, because of certain immigrants that aren't really very tall, usually. But if you control for race, the height has gone down. And that's an indication of basically demoralization, in my opinion. You could also say nutrition and stuff like that, but the nutrition, if anything, has gotten better, even though we have like additives in our food and stuff like that. Basically, I think you could argue that compared to 1950 or whatever, nutrition has gotten a lot more people have access to proper nutrition than they used to, and yet we're getting shorter. And another one is like people are getting married much later. They're getting married later and later. I've never been married. I'm a little bit different because I've never particularly had that as a goal, but I'm just saying generally in a society, people want to get married, And I don't remember, I did a video on this too, but like in 1960, I think was sort of like the apex of the lowest age, average age that people were getting married. And back then it was something like around 23 or something. And now we've gotten to, and then that gets complicated because like who are you talking about, the woman or the man? But just say like as an average, it's something like around 23. And now we're reaching a point where it's 30 or beyond. And then you really have a problem at that point. And that's basically the wealth disparity that we're seeing right now. And also people are having fewer kids, and that's also not a good sign. And like they're majorly having fewer kids. Like if you control for race in that instance in the US, and again, this is something people don't want to talk about because they don't want to talk about race. It's not on the agenda and nobody wants to be called racist. But who do you think are all the people that are having kids here? That is the reason that, our birth rate is so much superior to some place like Italy or Korea or South Korea or Japan or various places in Europe. And when you hear demographers talk about this and they'll be like, the United States is actually doing okay. And it's like, okay, well, who's having the kids? And they kind of conveniently gloss over that. So if you control for race and you talk about white people, they're basically having fewer kids than ever, So this wealth disparity thing, like I said, the only way to look at this would be to look at it historically. And historically, the way things tend to equalize is by a whole bunch of people dying. You saw it in World War II with what happened with how many people died in that conflict. Not so much in the United States. The United States kind of got off lucky, even though a whole bunch of people did die, like soldiers and stuff, speaking of Memorial Day. But, in Europe, they weren't so lucky. So we had like this boom, an economic boom in the 50s, partly because things had become equalized, and you had, from the perspective of standard of living as a function of like, having any money, the standard of living in the 50s was a lot higher. And then people say things about like black people. I really question how miserable they all were, To me, that's like a political talking point. You have people that are talking out of their ass about how black people were so miserable in the 50s. And it's like, did you talk to them? Do you know what their life was like? Like, yeah, you can say from certain perspectives, like that they didn't have the same rights and stuff like that, but that doesn't equate to happiness. It just doesn't. And it doesn't equate to contentment, and like feelings of like life satisfaction, as they say. And also the same thing happened with part of the reason the whole serfdom thing ended in the Middle Ages was because of the plague. And I'm not going to get into that, but like if you look at it historically, that's what happened. A whole shitload of people died, and it made it so that workers were more valuable, And so I don't really see how this ends, and maybe that's why people don't want to talk about it. I don't want to see people die. But the fact is like, this is sort of an intractable problem in the sense that, I don't want to keep going on and on, but if you just do this thing of like saying that you hate rich people, it doesn't, first of all, it doesn't move the needle, because you can hate them if you want, but what is that going to do? And second of all, if you look at someone like Jeff Bezos and you say, well, you have to give away, let's just say 10% of your wealth. You have enough houses, you have enough yachts, you have enough of this and that, and, there are other people who can barely afford to live. There is an epidemic of homelessness, and that's real. So you could say to Jeff Bezos, give away half your wealth. And then he would be like, well, why should I give away half my wealth? Some other guy, or 10% or whatever it is, why should I give away 10% of my wealth when, some other rich guy is allowed to keep his wealth? So that's part of the problem, because it's not even necessarily that all of these rich people are so insanely and sort of mercilessly greedy. Some of them probably are, but it's more like, how are you going to solve that from a policy perspective? And that's what would need to happen. And that's literally what would need to happen in order to avoid a whole bunch of people dying, is for some legislation to happen where it would just say, the wealth disparity has become something that is destructive to society, and the richest people are going to have to give away some of what they have so that we don't have people killing themselves and homeless, So, but then, like I said, you would need to decide like who that is, and none of these rich people are going to want to give away their money. And in a way, I don't blame them, because they're caught up in a game of like status, and they don't want to give up. They don't want to give away any of their status. All you have to do is look at your own life. Like, however much money you have, I don't have very much money. I can barely survive, but I have enough that like I could give $100 to like Doctors Without Borders or something like that. But like I barely, you know what I mean? Like, you don't want to give away your money. And especially if you're in a situation where you're a super duper rich person and you're I'm not really making an argument about like, some people are greedy. It's just a fact. And I would say that Jeff Bezos is greedy. But a lot of these people, some rich people aren't particularly greedy. They just got lucky and they worked hard and they figured out, or maybe they were born with a lot of money and it just kind of went up from there, kind of like Donald Trump and things like that. Someone has to make the decision of who's going to give away his money and his wealth, because none of these people are going to want to do it, because they're comparing themselves to the other people that are on their level. It may look like Jeff Bezos is richer than everyone else, but he's really not. There are people that are in his league, and he's going to say, well, why doesn't the owner of Viacom or whatever random, someone that's relatively close to him in terms of wealth, he's basically going to be like, well, why should I give away my money? That guy gets to keep his. So that's sort of the problem that we're having. Anyway, so I just wanted to explain the Matthew principle, and it's it's something that affects everything. You don't want to think of things as being based on luck, but when you're dealing with genetics and where people are born and the circumstances, things really do start to look a lot more like they're dictated by this Matthew principle, even though we have all sorts of laws and, like I said, laws and regulations to try to equalize things so that you can live in a society instead of whatever, like Darwinian eat or be eaten, whatever. Anyway, I hope that made sense. I feel like I wanted to explain it in a simple way. I'm not in front of like a whiteboard or anything because I don't want to show my face. But yeah, that's the Matthew principle, and it's basically a power law, and it exists, So I guess the point of having a government is to try to circumvent these things that would just naturally happen if you didn't do something to stop it. Anyway, I was trying to keep this at half an hour, and it didn't quite work out. Anyway, depending on when you're listening, have a nice morning, afternoon, night, whatever it is. Thanks for listening.